So with all that said, this is kind of a quick little history lesson, obviously probably not needed for a lot of us, but just as a little reprise. In 2007, Minnesota was really ahead of its time, and maybe some of you in this room were even a part of the coalition that really helped make this possible. We passed bipartisan legislation signed by Governor Parlenti, a Republican governor, obviously, called Minnesota's Next Generation Energy Act. And it basically was a renewable portfolio standard that put us as a state on track to decarbonize 80% by mid-century. Now you'll see that goal again in just a little bit, and that's really what's been updated largely. We met the first target of 15% reductions by 2015. We were struggling to meet the next target. And in many ways, since 2007, there has been nothing done in our state legislature to really tackle expanding that renewable portfolio standard. And back then, we were considered to really be in the top 3-5 states, kind of as far as ambition in the country. And since then, we've steadily progressed down into the middle of the pack. And prior to this, this last bill that was passed, we were in the mid-20s or even, I think, 30s, depending on your estimate. So it was in need of reform and update. And that's the context by which this next couple of slides are really going to be exploring. And then I will also save time for some of the next steps, given that clearly this bill has passed, but there's still a large legislative agenda session still ahead. So know that I'm going to talk about that in a little bit too. All right, so the basic idea behind the actual 100% clean electricity bill is that all electric utilities in the state are now asked to use 100% emissions-free energy by 2040. And the way they did that was they had, at a very high level, kind of two different kind of nested standards. They had a clean energy standard, which is getting at this emissions-free energy by 2040. And then they updated the renewable portfolio standard, which was at 25% by 2025. And now that's been updated to 55% by 2035. And so without getting too much into the weeds, and I know we have a couple of other resident experts that can also help clarify some of the, just thinking about these two baskets, some technologies like nuclear would not be considered part of the basket for the renewable portfolio standard, but they would qualify for the carbon-free standard. And some of the basket items that would be, well, I'll get into even some of the exceptions in just a little bit. But the definition by which each of these is defined is a little bit different, and we can get into that if people have questions. The biggest kind of top line message just to keep in mind overall is that basically the state updated the overall standard for clean energy, so not just renewables, to 100% by 2040, which is actually 10 years faster than what all of the major utilities right now had that kind of target be, which was targeting mid-century. And if we go back again, looking back even 16 years ago, 80% by 2050, now 100% by 2040. The level of ambition has definitely ramped up. So all that being said, one of the things that's, I think, most fascinating about this bill, at least on the state level, is that all of the major utilities, all the big independently owned operators came out either neutral or in favor of it, which is something to be said, obviously, given the challenge that they're now going to face with this additional expectation imposed on them. And so what are some of the off-ramps by which they, helped be won over? Well, the two biggest things, there's a third one here. One of them is called renewable energy credits. People probably have heard of RECs before. And it's this concept of, especially when we get to that final 10%, that's really hard to wring out the emissions. There's a way that they can, instead of themselves providing 100% carbon-free electricity, they can pay for renewable energy credits. And basically, it's like in some ways, it's like an indulgence, if you will, and that you can pay to have somebody else produce those additional hard to decarbonize final emissions for you. And so right now, RECs are very cheap. I'll use RECs, but again, it means renewable energy credits. There's been several podcasts where the Minnesota House Leader, Jamie Long, who used to be the chief of staff for Keith Ellison when he was in Congress, he's been interviewed and really has highlighted that, at least as, if I'm not misquoting him, he was saying that all of the RECs currently, at least, that are in use by these utilities are from Midwest sources, and most of them even from Minnesota energy providers. And so it isn't, obviously the concern with RECs is that, are they going to be from some faraway place? Are they really going to help benefit Minnesotans, since that's obviously the intent of this bill? His argument is that for the most part, those are all contained within the Midwest. The challenge, though, obviously, is that they're produced, renewable electricity credits are produced in excess when there's a whole bunch of extra wind or solar, and then really they're being credited for being used like at nighttime or intermittently when the sun isn't shining. And technically, obviously, that isn't then a time that is being produced by renewable energy. That's just kind of a credit. So it's not 100% accurate in my mind to call that 100% renewable if obviously you're kind of paying for something that's already happened and not actually not using it at that time period that is being demanded of it. The other big thing that the off-ramps that the bill provided is that if a utility gets close to this 2040 timeline and they aren't able to achieve it, they can appeal. There's an appeals process set up with the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, to basically have a standard of showing one of two tests. They can either show that by pursuing this and not making it, if they demonstrate that it's threatening consumer affordability or grid reliability, there can be exceptions made, whether it's an extension of the timeline or some other yet to be determined solution. That again, I don't know how high of a standard those tests are, but that is another significant off-ramp to be aware of, and that obviously if we get close to 2040 and utilities aren't able to meet that target, this is kind of the standard laid out for them to demonstrate that they can try to highlight either of these two concerns. The last thing that also I don't know a lot about, but another off-ramp is basically called something called beneficial electrification. And it's basically detailed in that if you as a utility can't provide 100% clean energy by 2040, but you have shown a significant and equivalent electrification benefit in like adoption of a EV network or whatever you can think of, they could potentially say, well, that's equivalent to this last section that's hard to decarbonize. So you get a pass, you're still 100%, even though it's technically not electricity. Maybe you made equivalent reductions with transportation emissions. So all of those off-ramps aside, hold your questions just for a little bit. A couple of the other exceptions to note that this bill updated. One of them is quite relevant for us here in Duluth. Well, a couple of them are. So one of the things about the Next Generation Energy Act in the early thousands was that because at that point lawmakers were concerned that large-scale hydro might be responsible for most of the renewable energy, they, I think it was 100 megawatts or less, said that only hydro that was small scale could count as a renewable energy definition. And this bill now updates that renewable portfolio standard to say that large scale hydro that's currently already on the books, which is predominantly what Minnesota Power is using right now to meet its decarbonization goals, that does count as renewable energy. So obviously, whether you agree with that or not, that's a significant update that now the lawmakers have argued that given that we have a significant enough kind of a head start on renewable solar and wind development, they are comfortable expanding that definition of hydro. The other big thing that the bill did was it discounted, it no longer includes waste to heat energy from Hennepin County, the HERC down there, as basically renewable anymore. And that's been a very controversial discussion for many years. And it was largely due to the influence of environmental justice communities, specifically within Representative Long's district, but throughout obviously the whole state, to highlight that, is this really a renewable solution? Is this something that obviously we should be trying to create incentives behind, given the health impacts for the neighborhoods all around North Minneapolis that have to breathe in that air from all of the incinerated waste that's immediately next to HERC. So that's an important update too. The other big thing that I know, for at least for a lot of the Duluth environmental community, was very frustrating was that the Nemaji Trail Energy Center is not included within kind of this expectation. Now, I'm not sure exactly about the full details on the exception made, but I know that that was something that was basically written in as a carve out. And so just to flag that, and obviously when we have other people that have been more involved in that in future forums, they can speak more to that. A couple other exceptions or things to note with the bill, one of which is that obviously we have 3 very large independently owned utilities in Minnesota: Power, Great River Energy, and Excel. But we also, as a state, are pretty unique in that, I forget the exact stat, but it's right around 50% of our overall electricity consumers are serviced by not one of those 3. So there's a lot of obviously greater Minnesota that isn't going to be within one of those 3 regimes. And as a result, even though all 3 of those large major utilities ended up coming out in favor or were neutral to the bill, a lot of the local smaller co-ops were against it. And the municipal energy providers were mixed. Munis is for municipal energy, co-ops is for obviously all the co-op electricity, like in the western part of the state or the southern part of the state. And so the one thing that happened within the bill negotiation process was that for the actual timeline for the munis and the co-ops, they had a kind of a longer timeline to get up to 100%. So rather than having to achieve 80% carbon-free electricity by 2030, their timeline was only 60% by 2030 to give a little bit more lead time to figure out how to change their energy mix and really meet this the standard. The last thing that people also might remember, if you were following the news back in 2007, has reared its head again, and it's our neighbor to the west, or at least one of them, North Dakota, has already filed a lawsuit against the state. Back then, it was all about lignite coal, and the standard was trying to figure out, whether or not lignite coal was something that was going to be excluded within the bill. And North Dakota ultimately ended up winning that case. This time, at least from what I've heard, the tea leaves look a little less favorable for their case. But their whole argument right now is trying to make the case that these standards should apply to energy produced in Minnesota, but not outside of Minnesota, including obviously a lot of the wind energy that we poured in from North Dakota. So that's an interesting thing to note, and we'll keep track of that. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of next steps. I'll kind of go for another 10 minutes here, and then we'll go back for Q&A. I'll just note here online. Perfect. All right, well, I'll cut up. Okay, so was anyone here part of the Rise and Repair Capitol Day on the Hill down in St. Paul last week? I know we had at least 7 or 8 Duluthians from what I've heard. I wasn't sure if anyone here was. So this is basically a platform that's put together. This is an incredibly small font, but I will put a link in the chat so that people, they can't read it here online or in person, can see the full list. You can also simply right now go to riseandrepair.org. And this is basically a coalition that's saying, okay, now that we've got the 100% bill passed, what can we do to build on that with this legislative session still? What are some of the additional priorities? And just as a note, the partnership list includes a lot of familiar faces, including our own, Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance, and the Minnesota Council for Churches, Eco-Faith Network, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, Honor the Earth, you name it, a whole swath of broad coalition partners that are really trying to rally and say, here's an additional set of priorities that we should be focused on, given now that we have this unique legislative session still with a lot of runway still to be able to pass things. So I'm going to actually take these in a different order. So some of them, I would say, based on conversations I've had with other local leaders, seem to be more likely to still make it through this session. Some not so much, but let's just talk about all 5 of the pillars, and then obviously we'll open it up for Q&A. But one of the main ones, obviously, that we're focused on is economic development and just transition. And so we're thinking through how can we continue to further incentivize the state to speed our energy transition towards renewables and also look out for our workforce. So one of the great opportunities that I know Brett Pence, the Northern Minnesota director for Minnesota Power and Light, was talking about this fall with the Inflation Reduction Act's passage is that now Minnesota schools have additional options to really create even further incentives for them to solarize. And so I know this is a really big focus for a lot of communities in the state, and Duluth is building momentum. If you'd like to find out more, I can connect you with the Duluth Climate and Energy Network, which is really trying to come up with a campaign about this. But this focus would be helping 100% of Minnesota schools have solar, electric buses, vehicle charging, battery storage, kind of the whole gamut of electrification by 2030. I feel like that's a very wonderful, clear, focused next step that seems like it has one of the most biggest legs still for the session. Another thing with the workforce is obviously trying to really highlight this lack of electricians coming through the overall kind of jobs pipeline for especially solar. So creating more incentives to have solar electrical apprenticeships, additional ways to be able to highlight, just kind of making that easy and incentivized for our up and coming workforce. Another thing that's interesting about the 100% bill already is that fair labor standards were included as part of it too. So prevailing wages, some of the other more union-friendly language was included in as a part of that bill. So I think that's helpful to note that that was already included with the 100% bill. Green bank funding, zero carbon affordable housing, like we heard from Rachel Wagner 2 weeks ago. Funding more transit. I know that that's going to be a big focus in this next month in the State House, is really just focus on transit equity, how we can use a lot of the surplus to really think through additional transit options, including the Northern Lights extension. I know that that's gotten some of the funding already kind of laid out by the governor's budget, but not 100% of it. Solar thermal heating, you name it, bonding. I know that's another big focus too. So that is the economic development and just transition lens. The other thing that I think has really got legs here within the environmental justice framework, obviously we as a state and especially in Duluth have really gotten more serious lately about replacing lead pipes. But there's this whole movement towards creating a plan for achieving zero waste as a society. And not just through, the 3 R's and composting, but really just this idea of from cradle to grave producer responsibility with their overall kind of products, especially with e-waste, and thinking through how can we create incentives to do a lot more of that electronics recycling or metals recycling here in the state. And so those are bills that I don't know the specific bill number on, but I know have been a big focus within some of the coalition here for Rise and Repair. There's another wonderful focus called Cumulative Impacts Bill, which is basically just making sure that communities that are already pollution burdened, like North Minneapolis with the Hennepin Energy Resource Center, are protected from additional pollution. So they're not going to be at the front of the line to have the next big industry that would also then further dirty their air. So that's overall with environmental justice. And then the other 3 planks, one of which is regulatory protection of people, land, and air. So within here with tribal sovereignty, creating a tribal energy advisory board to have more authority and interact with the PUC process, to really continue to honor and have more codifying of treaty rights and tribal regulations within the permitting energy process, to continue to work towards restoring the Minnesota Pollution Control Citizens Board, which kind of had received quite a big departure list of its membership in the last couple of years. Line 3 damage repairs, prove it first legislation, administrative rules for certificate of need in terms of consumer demand. All of those kind of within this lens, we can get into any questions people have on that. And then the last 2 planks, one of which is on reparations and sovereignty. So treating land and people as kind of obviously relatives and one of the same, centering communities that are most affected by climate change first and foremost, with opportunities to be a part of solutions, and making sure that the state continues to fund Native cultural initiatives and infrastructure investment, with a couple of great examples of what that might look like with programming already going down in the Twin Cities. Great, yeah, thank you for flagging that. If you're interested in tracking ongoing updates to that additional set of priorities for the session, it's riseandrepair.org. And I know Moose Jaw and many other groups, are part of this larger coalition. So that'd be where I'd steer you. They'll keep the website updated as soon as bill numbers are introduced. And obviously I'm sticking around. If anyone has other follow-up questions, feel free to come on up. Have a wonderful Sunday, everyone.